parents, both of our grandparents, were from the South. Yours were from,
My grandparents were from Tennessee, Franklin, Tennessee, and Pulaski, Tennessee.
and my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, were from South Carolina. My mom's were from Columbia, and my dad's were from Clinton, South Carolina. And we both were born in Pennsylvania. You on the west side,
Pittsburgh, born and raised.
and me on the east side, Norristown, Plymouth, close to Philadelphia. So, how did we get here?
The Great Migration.
All right, so that's what we're going to talk about. I'm Donna,
And I'm Will.
and this is Journey with Donna and Will. Before we get into our ancestors that were part of the Great Migration, we want to go over what was the Great Migration and what were the reasons for it.
And before the Great Migration, 90% of black Americans lived in the South.
So there's only about 10 that lived in the North.
That's right.
Interesting. So, what was the Great Migration?
It was one of the largest movement of people in the United States history.
Approximately 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the North between 1910 and 1970.
It can be broken down into two distinct time periods.
The first migration was between 1910 and 1940, and people moved to New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh.
The second migration from 1940s to 1970, north and further west to California, major cities including Oakland, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, as well as Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington.
Okay, so that's what the Great Migration was, the movement of African Americans. What was some of the reasons for it?
Many Southern blacks lived under the sharecropping system, which offered little economic opportunities.
Southern blacks lived under the Jim Crow law, which legalized racial segregation and denied many blacks the right to vote, to hold jobs, and to get educated.
Blacks who defied Jim Crow laws faced arrest, fines, violence, and death.
Ida B. Wells Barrett was instrumental in informing about lynchings that were going on in the South.
Industrial jobs in the North were available due to the world wars.
So, in addition, Ida B. Wells Barnett, she was credited with informing what was happening in the South with regards to the lynching. She also was one of the founders of the NAACP. She worked as a civil rights and women's suffrage activist. She's done a lot of fantastic things, and recently they've created a Ida B. Wells Barbie doll. So I'm not really into Barbie dolls, but I might have to get that one. So some of our ancestors participated in the first migration, which happened between 1910 and 1940.
And my grandparents, Roy and Rachel Kahn, migrated from Tennessee. They went to Detroit, Michigan. Of course, that's where the automotive industry was primary. And my grandfather worked briefly there at a slaughterhouse, is what I understand. They apparently left quickly. Detroit ended up in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, Beaver County, where my grandfather had a job there in the steel mill. And that's where also my father was born in 1933. And then ultimately they moved to the Hazelwood area of Pittsburgh, where I grew up. Now Hazelwood, J&L Steels was located. And also there was Homestead Works not nearby, where my grandfather worked, and my father worked as well. Primarily because of the industrial, of course, revolution, and the availability of jobs was the main factor for heading north.
So your grandmothers, a lot of your grandmother's sisters also wound up in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh.
My Aunt Ara, my grandmother's sister, lived about a block from us. And My other aunt, Aunt Claudia, lived in the Greenfield area, about 2 or 3 miles away from where I grew up. So they were a very close-knit, tight family, and they all tried to stick together, which they did, to raise their families.
My grandmother's younger sister, Lula Barber White, and her husband, Leon White, moved from South Carolina to New York in 1930s. My uncle Leon was a machine operator in New York. So they did participate in the first migration, moving out of the South up to New York. So my Aunt Lou, I wanted to dedicate this episode to my Aunt Lou, who passed away this past December at the age of 105. She was my grandmother's younger sister, and she will be well missed. She had a blessed life. She was always caring when we saw her, and she will be missed. So the second migration was between 1940 and 1970s, and my parents were a part of that migration. My parents lived in Anderson, South Carolina, and in 1962, my dad was called to pastor New Hope Baptist Church in Norristown, Pennsylvania. So my father, my mother, who was a teacher, and my older brother and sister moved to Norristown, Pennsylvania. As my dad pastored at New Hope Baptist Church, he also worked at OIC, Opportunity Industrial Center, and my mom worked in Philadelphia as a teacher. So they were part of the second migration. And that's how we got to Philadelphia, and that's how we got to Norristown from the South.
So during the second migration, did anybody from your family go west?
Yes, I did find out that my Aunt Ann, my mother's sister, who was a nurse, she migrated to Wisconsin at Fort McCoy in the 1940s via the military. And also my mother's brother, Uncle Kurt, again through the military in the 60s, he went to California and studied at San Diego State, and then worked as a real estate person in California. So there were some family members that moved out west. So we determined that how we got to Pennsylvania. It's all good things.
A great state of Pennsylvania.
Great state of Pennsylvania. And so that's how we got there, via the Great Migration. Our grandparents lived in the South and migrated up to the North, and we were both born in Pennsylvania. And that's how we got here.
And here we are.
And here we are. I'm Donna.
And I'm Will.
And this was Journey with Donna and Will.
And if you have any relatives that were part of the Great Migration, we would love to know. So please comment below.
Share and like, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.